Hey everyone, how's it going? Now, at the time of recording this video, I have just published the previous guy's video, and I know that it is probably something that a lot of people react to negatively since I was very negative and gloomy about the outlook of guys, but I'm just being frank there. I haven't seen the comment section yet because obviously it was just published, but I won't be surprised if y'all aren't too happy with the video. But hey, I have good news for you. We are going to move on to a new topic and I hope this will energize you up. This will be on the co-op side. We are going to look at Hasparroid post-Core 2.0 rotation. The biggest change to HB is obviously the loss of their go-to identity in engineering the future. So with that, now the other existing IDs can now compete on a fair playing level. Or can they? I think there's one ID that stands out amongst all of them, and yep, you're right, it's none other than everyone's favorite, Cerebral Imaging. Woo! Where are you going? Come back. No, don't worry. We are not going to play Power Shutdown Accelerated Diagnostics, don't forget, they're both rotating out. No wombo combos here, we're just going to play fairly honest Netrunner. This should appeal to you. So the reason why Cerebral Imaging is so powerful post-rotation is, well, there are two reasons. Firstly, you do not have to pitch agendas in the bin. When you draw lots of cards, you don't have to pitch multiple cards in the bin. This is usually bad for other corps because if you're forced to pitch cards in the bin, even if they are not agendas, it increases the agenda density in your HQ, making HQ very ripe for the picking with a legwork. But with Cerebral Imaging, if you can hold all the cards in your hand, even if the runner hits your hand, the chances of them hitting an agenda are not that high. So that's one very important reason. Without Jackson Howard to salvage or rather to filter your hand, Cerebral Imaging is the next best thing you can do. You can't filter your hand, but hey, at least you can buffer your hand with lots of random cards that hopefully mean that your opponent don't hit your agendas that often. What I believe is the more important reason, or maybe just as important, is the fact that CI has access to some of the strongest economy and draw cards in the game. It's none other than the clearances, and you can't really viably play these in any ID other than Cerebral Imaging. They just flood your hand too quickly, and with Ultraviolet clearance, you don't even have the option of Jackson Howard to back you up after that. You cannot install Jackson Howard with Ultraviolet and then shuffle the agendas you pitch because, well, Jackson's gone. So Cerebral Imaging seems like a very obvious candidate, and you want to play 3 copies of each clearance because they're just so good, they're so efficient. So we begin deck building with these 2 clearances in mind, and one synergy that immediately pops up when you look at the top left corner of these cards, you'll notice that these are very expensive operations. Is there any way we can play them while ignoring the play costs? Of course, it's not Accelerated Diagnostics, it's Brian Stinson. They are both transactions, so they work very well with Brian Stinson. Even though he's 3 influence a pop, well, you're not paying influence for Jackson Howard anymore, might as well splash some Brian Stinsons. Another synergy, which is not so obvious, but I think, yeah, a lot of you will have played it at some point or another, is Ultraviolet into Jeeves. This gives you an extra click after playing the Ultraviolet, which you can use to, play some of the cards you just drew, or maybe play a terminal, like a Violet level clearance. So the Ultraviolet into Violet combo when Jeeves is out is very powerful. The reason why I say this is rather unconventional, or most people don't think about it, is that you don't usually play Jeeves Motorboroids in CI. You usually think of CI as a lean deck, one which only protects centrals very lightly and attempts to fast advance 7 points in one turn. Again, this is not the kind of deck we are building, where we are going to throw away all our notions of traditional CI, and we'll just build a deck naturally, organically. Speaking of organic, what works very well with Jeeves? We know that Shipment from Sansan is a very powerful card in combination with Jeeves because it's a double that triggers Jeeves. Unfortunately, Shipment from Sansan has rotated as well. So the only other good way we can trigger Jeeves is with the in-faction Baltic Labor. Baltic Labor allows us to fast advance 3 2s, but in combination with Jeeves, it allows us to fast advance 4 2s as well. This is a very key component of this deck and probably one of the most powerful interactions that will be in the HB faction for quite some time. Especially with the loss of ABT, you are not able to play Jammy HB as well as you used to be able to. So the next best thing you can do is to increase the number of fast advanceable agendas in your deck by having this combo available to you, Baltic Labor into Jeeves. Also, do take note that with Wizard rotated out, it's going to be harder for runners to trash your Jeeves in general and your Brian Stinson. So this is something to look forward to. Naked Jeeves can be very good even in CI. You don't really have to protect it because trashing a 5-cost Jeeves is the runner's loss. Speaking of expensive to trash, we want the runner to go below 6 credits so that we can trigger Brian Stinson. We need some way to threaten them and to make them spend money, force them to spend money so that Brian Stinson will be live. Of course, close accounts immediately comes to mind, but we are not going to tag the runner here. So the next best thing we can do is to drag them through a remote into a threat. And one of the best threat cards we've had is something we've received in the final pack of that is Crimson Dust. Yep, it's MC Austerity Policy. We're going to toss MCA behind some ice and keep clicking it. It's going to drain the runner's clicks. It's going to force them to run. Otherwise, you fast advance a 5-3. So that hopefully brings you into Brian Stinson range. MCA Austerity Policy itself synergizes very well with a particular ice. Those that require the runner to spend 3 clicks to break it. That's right. Fairchild 3 is a very strong include and is basically a 3-off when you play MC Austerity Policy. They synergize so very well together, and you do always want to reserve Fairchild 3s for your remote whenever possible. Finally, because you notice that we are so reliant on fast advance between MCA Austerity and G's Biotic, we do need some anti-clot measures, and obviously CEVS is a card that we must play in this CI deck. At least 2 copies. I would love to have more, but deck slots are tight. Speaking of deck slots, let's look at the deck. Some other interesting deck choices here. Let's see. Crisium Grid and Miraju are actually very powerful in tandem. They allow you to stave off the central pressure for a bit while you try to build up to your victory. In a post-Jackson world, I do find that it is very difficult to combat runner win cons in terms of R&D or HQ deep digs. These are things that all corps must contend with in this post-Jackson world, and Crisium Miraju seems like one of the better solutions to that. Crisium covers you against R&D events such as indexing, deep data mining, Maker's Eye. And of course, the legwork dimension protects you if you're up against Criminal. As for Miraju deals with those less conventional means of multi-access. You have indexing and spy cameras, 2 very potent ways of peeking on top of your R&D, as well as find the truth. Miraju hoses that because you are able to shuffle your deck with Miraju if they decide to run R&D to fetch your agenda. Miraju on HQ also can do some work. So yeah, a pretty good combination together, and something that I'm not unhappy to spend influence on. After all, there isn't really much else you want to spend influence on. If you look at the rest of the deck, the money speaks for itself. When you're playing CI, all the best money is in faction, so you don't have to worry about splashing for it. Same with the win con, you have more than enough fast advance in faction to deal with winning, so you don't really need to spend influence on that. And Ice, well, HB Ice is one of the best already, especially when you're playing Fairchilds. Don't forget, Fairchild 2 suddenly becomes one of the best Ice in the game because York no longer is a thing. That's right, almost every runner has to pay at least 3 credits to get past this 4 to res Ice. Definitely well worth it. So because of this, I find myself with too much influence to spare, so much in fact that I can afford to spend on 2 Brian Stinsons. And a couple of other random Ice. Titanium's especially cheeky. Some people think that without Eli 1.0, HB doesn't have any good barriers left, and any barriers that remain can just be bounced off, like say the adaptive barrier. Well, this could be a nasty surprise if they don't find a paperclip in time. So this is my deck, and we will see how it fares. Today we are going up against Ayla, a very interesting runner. Alright, so it's Shaper. We have to first thing keep in mind that Clot is a problem that we have to deal with. Secondly, I get a pretty awkward opening hand. Usually, as CI, what you want to see on opening hand is none other than Violet level clearance. That is the premier card of choice. Otherwise, Hedge Fund kind of does the work. I didn't draw any of that, but I did have 3 pieces of ice, a Crisium Grid, and a sales team. I felt like it was worth keeping due to all the ice, and sure enough, mandatory draw into Violet level. That's the best thing you can ever hope for. So immediately, I put my best ice, which was IP block, on HQ, and went for the Violet level. You'll notice that, I have still kept the Mirage in my opening hand because I don't really know if I'm going to need it on HQ or R&D just yet. So I'll deploy it as necessary. First thing I do is to plop down the G's Motobioroids because if given that I'm against Shaper, I would think that it's very hard for them to trash a 5 cost Jeeves, but they immediately slap down the Parisia and immediately get value out of it. So this was such a pain. Seeing the Parisia hard counter my Jeeves. I really should have iced it, but then they meta me. They might have been watching my last game, I don't know, but they were suspecting that I might be running Brian Stinson, which I was. See, Brian Stinson is such a natural include in CI, so natural in fact that people are scared of the Stinson threat, so much so that they are not willing to trash a naked G's with a Parisia out because they are too worried about going below 6 credits. I wonder then why my opponent even decided to run that server in the first place, if they were worried about Brian. So sure enough, they would trash it, which is the right choice totally, because I did not draw my Brian Stinson. Getting a free Violet level clearance here would be so good. I have 1 in the bin. Using it with Brian Stinson would gain me 8 credits and draw me a bunch of cards. That is absolutely lovely. Too bad I don't get to fire that. But that is why Brian Stinson is so good. You fire off 1 clearance with it and it basically gives you enough money for the rest of the game. It's so powerful. So with Jeeves gone, the next best thing I can do now is to start clicking their MCA away. Now, because my opponent's only on 3 clicks on their turn, because they're too poor to use the SMC for decoder, I figure that the Fairchild 3 on the remote is more than good. If they decide to run it, I'll be more than happy to res the Fairchild 3 for them. That will put me at a very low credit level. You don't want to be poor as CI due to your hand size limit. But I just flat out knew that my opponent could not afford to run the MCA austerity policy, risking a Fairchild 3 hit. And this is why it's so important to save a Fairchild 3 for the remote. It is so good in combination with MC austerity policy, especially now that runner decks are typically slower. So I'm not going to be greedy here because I did not see my 5-3 agenda. So I'm running elective upgrade in this deck, and I did not see it on by the time I got to 3 MCA counters. So instead of waiting 1 more turn for MCA to tick off, I decided to straight away go for the sales team score. This was pretty risky. Clot threat was available. I was gambling that was either on their NV RAM in their hand, or maybe they weren't running it at all. And my opponent indeed did not sack the SMC for the clot. The reason why I felt rather comfortable with doing so was because if they wanted to SMC for clot, they would have to use up the SMC, meaning that they cannot challenge my remote anymore. And they can't click through the Fairchild 3 because I used the click ability of MCA austerity on the same turn I used the sacking ability of it. So there are 2 abilities on MCA austerity policy. A trick you can do to score 4-2 agendas is to power it up, add 1 power counter, and then sack it on the same turn. That will give you enough clicks to fast advance a 4-2 agenda. Normally, you would need all 3 power counters on it and to wait 1 turn later before you can score a 5-3 from hand. But you can do the 4-2 version as I did here. I explained why I did that. I didn't see my 5-3. Speaking of 5-3, the reason I'm running elective upgrade over global food in this deck is pretty straightforward. Now that the restricted and ban list has been announced, I am using Fairchild 3 as my restricted card in this deck. Therefore, I couldn't run Global Food. You bet that Global Food would be way better. Even though Elective Upgrade is yet another boost to your deck in terms of fast advanced capabilities, I really do not like the fact that it is a very vulnerable 5-3. If your opponent scores it, they are very well on their way to victory. This is something I don't really appreciate. Speaking of things I don't appreciate this HQ run either. It's making me feel very what am I saying? This is making me feel very uncomfortable about my opponent's board state. They must have something to do with HQ, otherwise they won't be running my hand. Although I do manage to tax them out a wee bit with IP block, it's not enough. They are well on their way with 16 credits, and all I'm going to do now is to play an Ultraviolet and decide what to slide in my remote. Here I choose to put the Vitruvius in here because I sense something ominous coming my way on HQ. Given the HQ run, it's very atypical for Shapers to poke HQ like that, and sure enough, it turns out my opponent was running the Gauntlet. This is the second time I'm playing this CI deck. In my first iteration, with a slightly older version of the deck, I lost to James Gray's Smoke, which was also running the Gauntlet. The Gauntlet seems to be a very popular card now in post-Core 2 and rotation. I'm not sure why myself. People are splashing it even in Shaper. Granted, it's only 1 influence, but I find that rather curious. I haven't played that many Core 2 games myself, so it's interesting to see. I suppose some of it has to do with the fact that Jackson is gone, But that being said, I feel like Astrolabe is still a pretty decent hardware console slot for Shaper, influence free at that. Anyhow, my opponent charges through my HQ, and with the paperclip is able to access 2 cards on each HQ run. Basically a HQ interface with the memory advantage. Unfortunately for my opponent, they miss. But I know that I still have 2 more agendas in hand ready to go. My opponent left themselves on exactly 6 credits, so I couldn't use the Brand Stinson that I just mandatorily drew. They are very smart, my opponent. They didn't go for another HQ run even though they could, because they knew that if they let me trigger a Brand Stinson, they would be in a deep load of trouble. So I do manage to get my Vitruvius out. My 6 senses were right. At least I managed to push that out, thinking that my opponent wouldn't check the remote. Unfortunately, this leaves HQ rather vulnerable. They can go in for a couple more runs and steal one of the 2 agendas in my hand, the sales team, the Vitruvius. These are at risk. As CI, you never like to see HQ pressure, and this is really bad news for me. I cannot really defend against HQ multi-access. Single access is fine. CI tends to do well against that, but multi-access is very painful, especially repeated multi-access, which my opponent now has access to. Let's see what they do here. We note that I think they sold off a fan site to Aesop's pawn shop just to get some money, and this turn they sold off the SMC even. So my opponent is not in a good state right now. They're, you know, if you know about people treading water in the ocean, well, this is worse than treading water because they're losing ground. You want to have the SMC out to threaten Claude to get your breakers out. My opponent only has a paperclip out now. Being forced to sell your SMC, you're so tight on money. This just goes to show how how weak your position is, that you're forced to compromise important aspects of your board state just to get enough money to go above the 6 credit mark, because apparently Brian Stinson is too much for my opponent to handle. But no, my opponent goes for the Dome Computer tech. What is this? With Dome Computer, my opponent doesn't have to break the IP block in HQ anymore. They'll just avoid the tag the IP block gives them, and this allows them to happily run HQ 4 times, sniping both my agendas. Important to note that my opponent's only getting single accesses here, so those HQ agenda snipes were incredibly lucky. That being said, that is some crazy tech. I didn't see that coming. That was certainly from left field. So the rationale behind Dawn Computer is one that I don't really get, but it kind of makes sense in this deck. Firstly, it's Aesop's fodder. Bare minimum, it's 3 credits for a click. Pretty good. Now, you think of matchups like Sync, Everything, Everywhere. Data Raven is a piece of ice that you don't really have any solutions to, but Dawn Computer allows you to get past it, steal some QPMs. What else? IP block, pretty prevalent in this meta, and if you're relying on an AI breaker, you're gonna take those tags, not if you have Dawn Computer active. So yeah, I usually don't approve of tech cards like these, but I guess it kind of makes sense. Anyway, I'm running tech cards myself too. Did you see the Titanium I just drew? What is this deck doing with Titanium? It's not like I even have any small agendas to sack to it. Yeah, Titanium is mostly there to punish anyone who thinks they can run without a barrier breaker, as mentioned earlier. But now that my opponent has Paperclip in play, no they don't. Paperclip's now in the bin. They installed over the Paperclip with Savon so they could do a deep data mining on R&D. Well, okay. That's going to cost them a lot of money to get the paperclip back, but more importantly, this deep data mining is going to fail. They thought it was a Branston's on R&D. Turns out it was a Crisium Grid. This is why you need Crisium Grid, to cover those R&D deep digging options, those legworks. And yeah, hosing a deep data mining is such a huge deal. That turned a 5 access into a 1 access. I can't stress enough how important Crisium Grid is now, even though account siphon's out of play. It also defends against cards like Notoriety, like Apocalypse. These are starting to become very popular options now that Medium is no longer an option. So yes, pack your Crisium Grids, people. If anything, Crisium Grid has gone up in stock since Core 2.0. And especially in CI, because they just don't see it coming. You never think, like, with all the connotations, all the bad connotations and of people thinking of CI as a fast advanced rushy deck that plays small ice, you wouldn't expect such chunky ice like Fetch Out 3 into heavy upgrades like Crisium Grid. So yeah, this disconnect actually helped me out a lot. My opponent did not see the Crisium Grid coming. They assumed it was a Bran Stinson, and I leveraged on that. Now, I have Hedge Fund in my hand, I have Violet Level in my hand, a lot of good cards. I'm going to overwrite a Fairchild 3 with a Fairchild 2. Simple reason, Fairchild 3 is not worth its cost anymore. 6 to res, only 4 to break with Savon. 4 to break is somewhat okay, but they can choose to trash a card and pay 2 credits instead. So I don't really like, the bottom line is I don't really like the fact that Fairchild 3 is so expensive to res and it can be easily broken with Savon. They don't have to worry about boosting strength anymore because Savon comes in at base strength 7. Too powerful for my Fairchild 3s. Funny enough, it doesn't break Fairchild 4, however. In a previous iteration of this deck, the one that I played against James Gray, I did actually have Fairchild 4 in my deck. Some of you may know it better as simply Fairchild, but anyway, Fairchild is 8 strength. That would have posed a very huge challenge for my opponent. Unfortunately, it's not in this deck, otherwise I would immediately slap it on my remote and go to town scoring agendas left, right, center. Sure, it's porous, but it's too expensive for my opponent to get through multiple times. Now back to this game. My opponent has been trying to gain some ground. They are still very consciously staying above that 6 credit mark, just right, which allows them to avoid the Brian Stinson. They've also played a Deuce's Wild and managed to expose the Miraju that's protecting my HQ now. I'm very what do you call that? Yes, I'm very, very concerned about the Gauntlet. Thing is, I haven't drawn any of my fast advance yet. The 1 MCA austerity policy early on was all that I got, and that's not enough. I have 3 Baltics in my deck and 2 more MCAs, but they are not showing up. Without those cards, I can't fast advance. So that's a big problem, because if I'm not fast advancing, these agendas are going to slowly pile up in my hand, and they'll get stolen very easily, because my opponent has Gauntlet multi-access. So the solution to this is Mirage on HQ. This is why I held it back from turn 1, and now I deduce that HQ is the correct server to place the Miraju. My opponent goes for the Shadow Net. Crazy! They were on 4 agenda points, but now they sack it all. Sack it all! Giving it all up for 2 sure gambles. Looks like I'm not the only one bypassing the play cost of events or operations here. My opponent's also packing the Shadow Net tech. So gaining lots of money with the gambles, allowing them to actually run through server 2 without worrying about what kind of ice may befall them. So yep, I'm just going to res these ice here to tax my opponent out, force the paperclip install. That's going to take away at least one of their sure gambles. And they're not going to even get an agenda for their efforts. It's just a Jeeves Motor Baroids. Are they going to even trash it? They do. They're rich enough to. Now, it's not all good for me though. That never advanced play paid off. Throwing stuff in the remote seems to do wonders in taxing my opponent. However, I still have a bunch of agendas in hand. Agendas that they're going to steal sooner or later. So that's not good. My opponent pawns off their Shadow Net, gaining more money from that. So yes, they're still treading water. They're still not gaining much ground. But yeah, that's because they can't play Magnum Opus. And this is why Magnum Opus can be really oppressive. If my opponent had access to Opus in this deck, they would just be slamming it all day, all night, and locking my remote. That's not fun. What's fun is having to draw cards, having to play around ESOPs, and having to decide which of your cards in your hand are more valuable, which cards are worth installing, which cards are worth pawning. This is more fun Netrunner to me. Anyway, I slid something in the remote that I now wish was my Vitruvius. I was too afraid. I thought my opponent would contest it, but that's not the case. So instead, I'm forced to continue icing up R&D, icing up HQ here. I need something in front of Mirage on HQ here. One of the biggest downsides to Mirage is that you give your opponent the choice. Do you break the set routine, or do you continue on the run? If they choose to continue on the run, they will get the shuffle effect, allow me to bury a card from HQ to R&D. I mean, shuffle it back to R&D. But if they choose to break the subroutine, Mirage that gets the res. And this is a big problem. I cannot afford repeatedly resing a Miraju every time they run HQ. So if Mirage is your outermost piece of ice, in theory your opponent could simply run HQ 4 times and force you to de-res and re-res Miraju 4 times. And that takes a toll on your economy. So this is why I needed an ice in front of it to make it economically unpalatable for my opponent to force the de-res on Miraju. They had to continue, and this meant that I could bury the Vitruvius. Remember, there was a Vitruvius in my hand. I shuffled it back to R&D. So this Miraju is paying off right here, avoiding what could have been a stolen agenda. But this is helping my opponent not win. This is not helping me myself win. And I'm starting to draw my big agendas. The elective upgrade has finally arrived, and I can't do anything about it. Again, no MC austerity, no Baltic labors. I run 3 of them in my deck. R&D is thinning down to single digits, and I still haven't found my fast advanced mechanisms. This is not good. I'm thinking of what to install with my ultraviolet clearance now, keeping in mind that I still have 1 extra click thanks to Jeeves, but I don't know what to do. I decided to install CVS in R&D, in case my opponent's running Clot. HQ might be the more obvious server because there are lots of ice protecting it, but I do not want to draw attention to HQ. There's too many agendas in there. And I'm going to install something new in the Jeeves remote. This is actually the second copy of CVS. I was very careful with purposely manually trashing the Jeeves first before installing the CVS over the Jeeves. Yeah, so this was done using a Jeeves click. Therefore, this is legal. I'm using the Jeeves click to install CVS over Jeeves Model Bioroids itself. And this is fine. What you cannot do is to claim the extra click if the installation was your third click. Sorry if that doesn't make sense, but basically, you're using a Jeeves click to install a card from your hand, so that's completely fine. If that means overwriting a Jeeves, then so be it. You don't lose the Jeeves click retroactively because of that. So now my opponent goes for the HQ multi-access again, and they let Mirage fire once again. Now Mirage has a very interesting mechanic in that, I'm reading the text right now, the card draw is optional. I can choose whether to draw or not. Here I choose not to draw because I know R&D is pretty dense with agendas and I do not want to draw an agenda which my opponent will then steal. Regardless of my decision, the second clause still fires. That is, I will then shuffle a card from my HQ into R&D. And I chose to shuffle the elective upgrade so that my opponent could not get their filthy hands on my 3-point agenda. Seeing no other agendas in hand, my opponent was forced to go for the other vector of attack, the less sure one, given that the only possible good outcome was the final 3-2 Vitruvius that I had left in my deck. Remember, no ABTs, so this had to be a Vitruvius. It could have been a 4-2 agenda that was waiting to Baltic out as well, but that wasn't the case. It ended up being a ruse. It was Branslinson into the newly installed CVS. So I wanted to have double CVS available in case my opponent went Sacrificial Construct Clot. We've seen the sac con there, so I do know that my opponent's probably running Clot. We need that safety buffer. With their last click, what can my opponent do? It's a pretty tough call. They know they're on match point, but well, not really on match point, am I? The thing is, by sacking both of those agendas, my opponent actually set themselves further back. They can't go for a desperation run on R&D, say, to win them the game. So running R&D was out of the question there. Back on my turn, I found exactly the card I needed to speed up the game. With MC austerity policy, I can now threaten match point, threaten match point, because if I have a 5-3 agenda, I can score it via fast advance. And even if my opponent has Clot, they should know that by not trashing the CVS in my remote, it will come back to haunt them as I can fast advance and use CVS to clear the Clot. Speaking of that, because they chose not to trash the CVS in the remote, that basically tells me my opponent isn't running Clot. So I'm not really worried about fast advance at this point. My opponent runs HQ here, and I choose to not draw a card with Miraju, instead reshuffling the final agenda left in my hand, which was the SFT. With this, I no longer have to worry about giving my opponent agendas. So the very fun thing about Miraju is I can keep myself at 1 agenda in hand. As long as I keep exactly 1 agenda in hand, my opponent cannot win on HQ. Right? If they run through HQ, they're forced to let Miraju fire or get bounced off to archives. If they let Miraju fire, what happens is the 1 agenda that I was holding goes back to the deck. So basically their only win con was R&D, but because they didn't trash the Crisium Grid on their earlier deep data mining run, I did not have to worry about a deep R&D dig either, knowing that the deep data minings are pretty dead for some time, knowing that they're way too poor to trash my Crisium Grid. Parisia doesn't help with that. Even if they did have a spare Parisia, even if they didn't pawn it to pawn shop, that wouldn't help with trashing Crisium Grid either. So basically I'm in a pretty comfortable position now. The only real problem is I need to win off an elective upgrade top deck. Now I run 2 copies of it in my deck, and I'm down to what seems like 6 or 8, I can't see it clearly, but a single digit number of cards in my deck, so I should win sooner or later. But if I draw all the other agendas in my deck before the elective upgrades, things could get dicey. Not to mention that I cannot score the elective upgrade until I get 3 tokens on MCA, so my opponent still has some outs here and there. Not to mention, if they do snipe an elective upgrade of R&D, that is the last thing I want to see, and they might be wary enough that they choose to go for R&D and deny me this win con. After all, you must think that I've been bearing agendas with Miraju simply because my opponent has been running HQ so many times, giving me all the Miraju fires. It has been doing so much work for me this game. It's almost like a Jackson Howard in itself. Now my opponent is debating with themselves. They know they need to defuse the threat, and that's the amazing thing about austerity policy. Something that very few other Netrunner cards achieve, corp cards I should say. They place such a huge threat on the runner. Not only are they losing a click, they also have to contend with the fact that if they leave it untouched, it's going to give a huge advantage to the corp and advance their win condition. So my opponent had to go for the big turn here. They install Harbinger out of nowhere. No one saw that one coming. And I don't mean that sarcastically. They pay 4 credits to break Architect with Savant. Then they let the entire Fetch out 2 fire, losing 2 credits to the first subroutine. No, actually, yeah, they lose 2. Interesting. Anyway, they break one of the subroutines by trashing the Harbinger, turning it face down, and then they take the brain damage. They've already taken quite a few this game. They are now on 3 brain damage. IP block fires. They use computer dom computer to get past IP block, and with 3 credits remaining, they manage to trash the NTA austerity policy. So they get in just right. Good for them. Now, the tough part, which was why they were hemming and hawing so much, was because by trashing the MC austerity, they gave me what I've been looking for this entire game, the Brian Stinson window. And I'm gonna abuse it right now. My one chance to fire off Brian Stinson, of course I'm going to use it. So first up, we're going to use it on Ultraviolet Clearance, and it draws me Elective Upgrade, Biotic Labor, Biotic Labor, Biotic Labor. I do some maths. Install Elective Upgrade for free with Ultraviolet's installability. 2 clicks left. Biotic, Biotic, Biotic. 3 clicks. 4 clicks. 5 clicks. That's game! Pew pew! Who saw that one coming? Did you see that? Did you see that last turn? Talk about a wombo combo turn. If you thought my guys playthrough had a crazy combo turn with Maxwell James and whatnot, this was a whole new level. That Brian Stinson into Ultraviolet gave me literally everything I was looking for to win the game. The money to play triple biotic, and every single card I drew ended up being a combo piece. The triple biotic into elective upgrade. Now, and also not to mention that I finished with no clicks remaining, and that was helped by the fact that Ultraviolet gave me a free install action to take. So, wow, that was just absolutely nuts, absolutely bonkers. Who would have thought that Ultraviolet on Brian Stinson would end up being a combo component? Obviously, this wouldn't have happened if I had a better draw. The 3 Baltics were certainly not meant to be stuck at the bottom 4 cards as the bottom 4 cards of my deck, but hey, it made for an entertaining watch. I can't complain about it. Yeah, but the main thing that won me the game was not so much the ability to pull that combo off, but more of the fork that I presented the runner. As I mentioned from the start of the video, they were treading water and losing their ground most of the time, rolling down a hill that they were trying to climb, so as to speak. They were pawning with their pawn shop more than they were installing, and they were losing, not gaining in board state over time. This allowed me to set out a position where I was asserting huge dominance. It ended up being a position whereby they either had to let me have the MC austerity, which was the ability to fast advance 5-3, or to give me a Brian Stinson trigger. And obviously, I think from my opponent's side of the board, it made perfect sense to go for the austerity, because you wouldn't expect Brian Stinson to be a win con in itself. Hint, hint, it ended up being one. So yeah, if they actually let me have the MC austerity in that particular board state, I would not have won, because my mandatory draw was, I believe, the SFT. So I would have a loaded MCA, but I wouldn't be able to do anything with it. I could fast advance a SFT, sure, but I wouldn't have won that very turn. So it's crazy how things worked out for that game. But yeah, amazing stuff you can do when you tax the runner out when you force them to run your remotes, and that's what austerity pressures the runner to do. It's a nice threat card. Another card I want to laud here is Miraju. It is not by any means Jackson Howard, but in this game it did everything I wanted a Jackson Howard to do for CI. If there was one way I was going to lose, it was by the repeated hammering of HQ by my opponent, who so smartly went for the gauntlet against a deck that doesn't like HQ multi-access. CI really hates HQ interfaces, and the gauntlet makes things worse, because the more you try to ice up HQ, the more the cards they're going to see. But Miraju completely solves that problem. you will notice that if they're getting successful runs through HQ, they're not breaking the Miraju. So first things first, they're not actually getting multi-access of the additional ice that is Miraju because they're not breaking the subroutine on it. Secondly, when they pass through it, I get to shuffle agendas from HQ back to R&D. So it was basically a multi-use Jackson because it doesn't remove from game after use. It stays on HQ saying, hey, come run HQ. You're not going to get anything because I'm going to shuffle them all into R&D. In fact, one of the best things my opponent probably could have done was to do a Miraju HQ run followed by running R&D. That way they would have a pretty increased chance of getting an agenda from R&D as it is now more stacked. That would have actually been interesting. But yeah, my opponent never really had the economy foothold to do such a thing. So yeah, I think one last point that I haven't put in my slides is that this particular CI deck is well positioned in the current meta, especially when you take the ban restricted list into consideration. Firstly, with runners losing out on big economy options in Temujin and Blue Moose, alongside the fact that Magnum Opus is on the restricted list, meaning that if you're playing Esops, you can't have Mopus at the same time. This means that runners are generally poor, and this is very good news for Brian Stinson. You need not put in that much effort to make the runner go down to below 6 credits. That was something that was very hard to do in the Temujin era, but now it's a high possibility, and it's why Brian Stinson will see a lot more play. Second thing is, what was I gonna say? I forgot. Well, if I remember, I'll bring it up in the next video where I'll actually do a proper review of the restricted and the ban list. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, as always, thanks for watching and happy nut running. Goodbye.